glaciers up in the Himalayas contain the water on which 40% of humanity depend for their drinking water. And some of those glaciers are almost gone. When the Dalai Lama was out here in New Zealand some months back, last year I think, the only political party that actually welcomed him and invited him to meet with the MPs was the Greens. Everybody else was too afraid of China to do that, but we had a most wonderful half hour with the Dalai Lama in our caucus room. He's an inspiring and also very funny man to talk to. But he said he was severely worried about what was happening to the glaciers in the Himalayas and therefore to the water supplies of not just his people but many of the peoples of Eastern and Southern Asia. You can see a graph there of sea level rise. You can see my cracked earth picture again. The IPCC, the climate change scientists, say the earliest and most serious effect of climate change will be reductions in fresh water availability. And they're expecting drought to be the biggest driver of starvation in many parts of the world, particularly Africa, where they haven't got the capital to invest in big technological ways of getting water to their food production areas. They're marginal already in terms of the rainfall they get. A little bit less rainfall in Africa is the difference between life and death for millions of people. And up in the top left, that map of the world is an indication of what's happening to the acidity of the oceans. The oceans are protecting us from climate change by absorbing a lot of the carbon dioxide that's been released, and the consequence of that is that they are becoming slightly acid because you dissolve carbon dioxide in water and you get a weak carbonic acid. And those colours represent where the acidification is greatest and where it is least. That has a serious problem in that, as one of the reasons why coral reefs are dying, anything that relies on making limestone for its shells is going to be seriously affected by more acid water. So that is at the base of the whole marine food chain is threatened by the oceans becoming more acid. So there's climate for you. And all of this leads us to a conclusion. The problem is not just oil. The problem is not just water. It's not just food. It's not just land. It's not just fish. The truth that nobody wants to hear is that we are bumping up against the limits of the planet. That we are an increasing population with a very rapidly increasing per capita level of consumption in a world with limited quantities of resources. And we can go through them one by one. Oil and gas we've talked about, you've seen the graphs. Fresh water we've talked about. Fish we've talked about. And land. The first three all in decline. The last one not getting any bigger, and to some extent also in decline, because as populations grow, cities spread across arable land, and you also, water loss means you get desertification. So more and more demand, less and less supply. What happens? Prices go up. And there's two kinds of resources. There's the resources where we've got less of to supply our needs, but there's also the limits of nature to absorb our wastes, because our economy relies on a lot of free services from nature, both to supply the raw materials we need and to deal with our junk when we're finished with it. You could say that an economy is a way of turning resources into junk. If you look at all the materials that we consume and throw away every day, the average time for all of those resources that they are actually being used by people between the end of manufacture and the beginning of throwing away is actually a few days. Example of that, climate change is because the atmosphere, we've outgrown the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gases that are the result of us burning fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide and also the methane, nitrous oxide and others. Our rivers are in a bad state, and most lowland rivers in New Zealand are not safe for children to swim in any longer because the stocking rates of our farms are now so intense and we use so much fertiliser that the runoff from that is leading to nitrates and bacteria in rivers, and that we've exceeded the capacity of those rivers to deal with that waste and process it and take it out to sea. Air pollution in cities is another one. It's amazing, isn't it, what the lengths that Beijing went to try and make sure that people would be able to see each other across the street during the Olympic Games. They shut down half the industry just to try and deal with the worst of the pollution. And the athletes went over there and they couldn't breathe and they got sick. I mean, how people can live like that for the whole of their lives, and this is how much of the world lives when it's trying to industrialise and catch up with the standard of living, so-called, that we have. So what's the link then between oil and climate change? Are they two separate phenomena? Well, this is my prize slide. This is the one that one of the techie guys at work did for me this week, and it looked absolutely amazing, but we just don't have the function on this computer to make it work. But what's meant to happen is this dark stuff here is the oil reservoir in the ground. And when you click the right thing, that reservoir shrinks. The oil all disappears, it goes up through the chimneys of the factories and it spreads out in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases and causing climate change. So it was such a nice little gimmick, but I guess we're going to have to find what function we need on computers to make it work. But the simple story there is the oil that's no longer down there for us to mine, and which is making our petrol prices double, is now up there in the form of carbon dioxide changing our climate. They are two sides of the one coin. So it's hardly then a radical conclusion when you look at all this information to say life is going to change. That's not something the Greens are going to cause, that's something that's going to happen. And the question is, can we actually change it for the better? Can we grasp this crisis and turn it into a better way of living than what we have now? That sounds like a challenge, but I think it's a challenge worth taking on. I've got two grandchildren, they're 3 and 7 months, and I'm totally dotty about them, as most grandparents are, and I want them to have a life that's worth living. And if we just let this happen without grasping the opportunity and doing something with it, they won't have a life that's worth living. If we're talking oil then, or if we're talking climate change, the big place to start is transport. Greenhouse gas emissions, and it's most of the oil that we import. So if we can use transport more sensibly, we can solve climate change and peak oil at the same time. And did you know that a third of all car trips are less than 2 kilometres distance? And there's actually a lot of quite easy ways of travelling 2 kilometres for most of us. There are people, of course, who can't travel 2 kilometres other than by mechanised transport, but many of us can walk, many of us can cycle, and those active transport methods are a way of reducing our fuel bill, reducing our emissions,